Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. So in this video, I'd like to think about whether we are morally obliged or whether we should or ought always do what is best. And here, I mean it in the strict sense, like you have different options. Should you always choose what seems to you like the objectively better option? Like you could eat a sandwich or you could go to Mass. Are you therefore bound to go to Mass? I think a lot of us respond kind of instinctively and think, wait a second, I think I need to eat and I need to sleep, and Mass is good, but if I'm always going to Mass like 12 times a day, maybe that's overdoing it. So we have some good instincts insofar as we have a way of sorting out what's best, but like given the circumstances. But I thought in this video we could just talk about maybe some principles and then some arguments so we could think better about that so as not to tie ourselves in knots and ultimately to come into better appreciation of the freedom of the sons of God with which we have been blessed at our baptism. So here we go. Okay, so the example of should I always be at Mass is a little bit farcical, and it's meant to be because it's supposed to drive home the point that, yeah, there are things that are very, very good, in fact, best described in objective terms, and yet they don't have a claim on us to always be in attendance or to always be in pursuit because our human lives are more subtle and complex, right? They're a kind of gentle whoop and wharf. I don't actually know what that is supposed to sound like, but there's some image and it has to do with weaving, blah, 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 tapestry. You get what I'm trying to say. So I think that this question of whether I ought to always do what is best kind of is more like asking the question of how do I go about doing what is good for me in the circumstances. Now, when we introduce it in those terms, I don't want to suggest some like relativizing of the good, right? As if we were to simply say that's like, you do you and I'll do me and we'll just never talk to each other because our lives will look totally different. But what I'm trying to do is not to overgeneralize in a way that loses sight of the individual. Because while we're not individualists, in the bad sense, we do have to take account of the fact that each of us have been made with particular gifts, right, with particular talents, and with a particular vocation. So the way in which we pursue the good should reflect that. Okay, so there is an objective order of goods. We need to affirm that at the start. And many people are unwilling to do so, which makes us want to push back and say like, no, acknowledge the fact. Okay, so Mass, we refer to the Eucharist as the source and summit of our faith because it contains our Lord Jesus Christ, not just sacramentally, but also substantially. So we're talking about something that's very, very worthy, right? That's very, very good. And then, I gave the example of whether we should attend Mass 12 times a day. It's like, well, I suppose, we can receive twice, and it's good, I guess, even to go without receiving. Well, no. Back it off because we have to subjectively appropriate those goods that are proposed to us, that objective order of goods, in light of any number of factors. So one is, our identity and mission, or our nature, to use the philosophical term. So who am I, okay? And then what am I made for? And you can take that just as a human being, okay, but also as this human being. So for instance, certain things will appear better to us on account of the fact that we are human beings, that we're made to the image and likeness of God, right? So wealth is a good thing, right? But wealth is artificial wealth is for natural wealth, which is to say use money to buy clothes and shelter and food and stuff like that. But artificial wealth, unless you're Scrooge McDuck, you don't derive much pleasure from swimming through it. And then when it comes to natural wealth, you can only eat so many times a day, you can only clothe yourself so many ways, and you can only have so many houses. I suppose there are exceptions to those rules insofar as many people accumulate to a bewildering extent. But, wealth, yeah, it just doesn't hold up, right? It doesn't hold up. So why did I mention wealth? Because I was talking about who we are and what we're made for. So you're not made for wealth. Wealth is helpful, but it's not like your ultimate end. And you can go through any number of things, and you'll come to discover that we're all made for God, but that God makes us for himself in particular different kind of refractions of his divine light, or as particular refractions of his divine light. So he doesn't call us all to be the same saint, right? He gives our Lord Jesus Christ a quasi-infinite grace in his human nature. He gives the Blessed Mother the highest imaginable graces accorded to a mere creature, right? And then you look among the different saints and you see them given different things so as to magnify different aspects of the divine life. And we too share in that same dispensation. So we're human beings, okay, but we're this human being and we're called for this particular mission. So we need to take account of how that unfolds. But we also need to take account of how it unfolds in this time, in this place, and in these circumstances, okay? So it's not just like, aha, general proposal of the objective order of goods, okay, that is relative to me. It's addressed to me, and so I need to appropriate it subjectively. And that's going to be in light of like my state in life, for instance, right? So I'm a priest and a religious. Most of you watching this are neither priest nor religious. So that makes a difference. Like I'm bound to certain things. You aren't. Like I need to say the liturgy of the hours every day. As a Dominican, I need to recite the Holy Rosary, make 30 minutes of meditation at the least. You're not bound by that. Those are good things, but just because someone else is doing them in the world doesn't mean that you have to, okay? We also have to take account of our duties and responsibilities. So some of you listening are parents, fathers or mothers. You need to take care of your kids, especially when they're young, because otherwise they're just not going to flourish as human beings. So their needs, their demands are important for your concrete and particular life. It's not like you're going to get holy despite the fact that you need to take care of these kids. It's like, no. You're going to get holy in and through your taking care of these kids. So, objective order of goods, subjective appropriation. And then this helps us to reflect on what we are, who we are as human beings. And I would just say simply that we're not optimizing, maximizing machines, okay? Human life is something far more subtle and nuanced. And life is not like, I had a professor in college who said life is not a philosophic calculus, okay? As if it were just a matter of trying to figure out how best to maximize happiness, like pleasure happiness. No. There's something more at stake. Positive psychologists talk about the difference between what they call hedonic happiness, like pleasure happiness, or eudaimonic happiness, which would be like meaning happiness, okay? So we're seeking a particular meaning in this life, and hedonic happiness, so from eudaimonic happiness, hedonic happiness will follow, which is to say, from pursuit of meaning, then you'll come into an appreciation of a certain amount of pleasure. But if you don't pursue things that are meaningful, then you will come to discover that you have banished from your life all that is pleasurable. Because life like that, yikes. So we're in search of meaningful pursuits so that we can build a life and abide in a life that is close to those meaningful pursuits, or that is shaped around those meaningful pursuits. So to take account of this, we need to have before our mind's eye the fact that God is provident, okay? So God is provident. He gives us a particular life, He gives us particular talents because He's good, right? And because it is good, and because we are thereby made good. Beloved, we love because God first loved us. Every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights. So God is loving us in particular ways, and the way that He loves us will unfold in the way that we respond to that love, okay? And so God sets us up for sanctity. God doesn't afford us with the most limited resources, scant resources, and then kind of sit back and wait for us to fail. No, crazy town, okay? God wants us not so much to succeed in the prosperity gospel sense of the word, but wants us to draw close to Him in intimacy and the sublimity of the divine life. And then you are free, okay? So you are genuinely free. Your life is in your hands. So you are called to tell forth a unique manifestation and communication of the divine abundance. And it might be the case that you're doing this thing which is modest or humble, or you're doing this thing which is hidden. And that's not because you can't hack doing the other stuff, right? Which might be more grandiose and exalted, or which might be more overt or visible. No. You're being called to do something that fits within the context of the whole as you play your part in the mystical body. So we become, together, the one worshiping Christ. So it's not like you're not just doing these things because you can't hack these things. You're doing these things because they reflect the particular way and personal way in which God is loving you. Okay, so let me give some examples and see if we can suss out some of the details. Okay, should you smoke a cigar tonight, right? Or should you drink a couple beers tonight? So these would be examples of things which in the strict sense aren't great for your health. All right, there are studies that go back and forth as to whether or not red wine is good for your health, but I don't know of many studies that say that beer or cigars are good for your health. You might be able to make the argument that they're not bad for your health, but if you think about it in these optimizing, maximizing terms, you can get yourself tied in knots. Okay, things to take account of. Health. Does it negatively affect you? Might you have a history of cancer in your family, specifically of mouth, throat, or tongue cancer? Okay, that's to be taken account of. Does it really disrupt your sleep? Do you find that you're basically unable to function the next day if you smoke a cigar or two or whatever? Okay, take account of that. Is there a problem of addiction, right? Do you have the past kind of experiences which would indicate that, yeah, maybe not? or of dependency. People are going to make the argument like, well, if you're not addicted, if you're not dependent, then just don't do it. It's like, well, no, that's not super helpful as far as arguments go. But okay, think about it. Okay, I'm a Dominican friar. I have to think about it in terms of poverty too, because cigars are kind of seen as luxury products, even if they're cheap. And then there's a question of scandal, right? So some people are thrown for a loop when you talk about smoking a cigar. So, all right, are you going to be in the presence of people who would be thrown for a loop? Should you be sensitive to that? Thinking here about like the weaker brethren principle. So why am I sussing out all these different things? It'll depend, okay? So I think that you could smoke a cigar and have a couple beers, or you could not smoke a cigar and have a couple of beers. You might exercise both options because you are genuinely free, and this could fit within the setting of God's providence. And just because you're not at Mass doesn't mean that you're sitting. Because it might be a wonderful opportunity to share a moment with a friend who it takes some time to open up with, right? And the thing that helps you to open up might be a cigar or a beer. And then the person says in the background, well, shouldn't you work on opening up in other ways? It's like, listen, we live here and now and in these circumstances. And it's not a sinful thing, right? So you don't have to bewail the fact that I used a cigar and I used some beers to have a great conversation. It's like they're good in this limited and restricted way. So that's an example. Another one, okay, buy local, or like don't support these huge global businesses which put smaller vendors out of business. Okay, so that's like a thing that you might take account of. It's good, I think, to support local business insofar as local businesses run ethically and helps to contribute to your municipality. My parents ran a little Catholic bookshop for 22 years, which was cool, but at a certain point it became impossible because my dad was paying into it because Amazon was just better equipped to sell things at inexpensive prices and to ship them to your door in 2 days, and the convenience and the savings just made it impossible. Okay, so is that lamentable? Kind of. I mean, I don't think that anybody in my family was super pumped about that store in the sense that we were all like, yeah, rah rah sis boom ba, may it last until forever. But it was also a cool thing. Like a lot of people came to the store to talk to my mom, and it was a great place for growth in the faith and for evangelization. That's kind of how it ended up. And then for pilgrimages, they ran pilgrimages out of there. But yeah, like, okay, should people have bought local? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so we have limited resources, and one of those resources is money, and we're going to be able to make our money stretch further if we're using it this way. Might that have long-term consequences, which eventually make things more expensive? It could, right? It could, to be taken account of. And then like, okay, shouldn't I support my local municipality? Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. That's a good thing. But also like you're super busy and you have a variety of demands. And if you can Instacart it to your front door or Amazon it to your front door, I think that's to be taken account of. Does that make you lazy? Is that undermining your life or your freedom in the long term? Perhaps, right? But provided that you're using that extra bandwidth for noble purposes, spending time with your kids or going to the park or doing whatever, right? Or like reading a book about God, that's good. That's noble. And I don't think that like we need necessarily eschew all conveniences or time savers or money savers just because they're associated with. Now, Amazon is like a very, very, very scary company for a variety of reasons. So that has to be taken account of too. But I'm not just saying that like once we crack the nut, then we'll be able to find the right answer. I think that you could legitimately exercise both options and you could exercise them virtuously. Boom. Okay. Last example. Where are you at in this point? Yeah. All right. Time for one more example. Discernment of a vocation. I think that basically everyone is called to marriage. Why? Is that a concession to your weakness? No. It's because that's what God intended. So in the garden, there is marriage. There's not priesthood and there is not religious life. Because in the garden, the life of grace was intended to be communicated to subsequent generations by family life, right? So man and a woman love each other. They come together in the context of marriage. They enjoy a conjugal life, and the fruit of their love are children. And in the ordinary course, God would have infused the soul of those children with the life of grace. So marriage is the ordinary means whereby divine life was communicated. So the fall, okay, things get complicated. You got priesthood and religious life now, not just, well, you get it. So that's on the table for your discernment. But ultimately, like, what are we discerning when we discern? We're discerning how God is calling me in my particular life to love him and my neighbor, to grow in holiness, right? To make manifest and communicable his glory and to save my soul and perhaps the souls of others who rely on me. Cool. Okay. Get married. All right. Well, maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's more complicated than that. Probably not in most cases. Okay. And when it comes to discerning marriage, I don't think you have to discern marriage. I think you just, you find someone whom you like and maybe even love, and then fall in love, and then envision a family, and then ask a question, and then go from there. I don't mean to like say it's just whatever, not that important. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it doesn't need to be over complexified. Like, I don't think you need to discern marriage in the abstract. I think you might date or court or exercise whatever means are most fitting in your time and place and circumstances. Okay? So just because, all right, for instance, religious life is objectively higher than marriage. That's how it's described in the church's tradition. Why? Well, because it proposes higher means to the attainment of salvation. So poverty, chastity, and obedience. The evangelical counsels, which religious espouse both in spirit and in fact. Okay, so the evangelical counsels have a way of healing, have a way of kind of like curbing your solicitude for secondary goods, and then they have a way of offering the individual to God in sacrifice, a most pleasing sacrifice, which is awesome. Okay. But because that is objectively higher does not mean that it is for you. Because again, it needs to be subjectively appropriated. It needs to be made yours. And if God has not been stirring up within you the kind of temperament which inclines to this life and which would flourish in the context of this life, then it's not for you, right? So again, your call, your vocation is something concrete and particular. It's yours. And God's going to suit you to a life in which you are meant to flourish, ultimately, to experience His providence and your freedom in a way that helps you to make sense of these questions like, what is good for me here and now? Rather than to think in abstract and strange terms of like, what is optimal, maximal, best for all people of all times and all places? And then how do I jam my life, my square life, into that round hole? So I say this to affirm for you the fact that God is for you, not against you. And as you grow in the life of grace through prayer and sacrament and penance and friendship and study of the faith and service of the material poor, all right, your desires are going to continue to heal and to grow, and God will make it more and more plain to you what that good for you is in fact, without relativizing the claim of the gospel, but also without suffering under a kind of strange generalization, which makes it hard for you to know your true identity and mission in Christ. Boom. All right, that's what I wanted to share. So, things to know. First, this is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get email updates, and all good things will follow in turn. Also, I contribute to a couple of podcasts that you might want to check out in addition. So the first is the Thomistic Institute, bi-weekly conversations with Thomistic Institute speakers, so you can find that on the Thomistic Institute podcast. Second is called Catholic Classics, which is a new podcast from Ascension that I do with Father Jacob Bertrand, and we're reading the Introduction to the Devout Life and then providing some commentary on it, and that'll last 45 consecutive days, so it just launched at the end of October and it'll run through the beginning of December, so check that out. And we'll have seasons coming out, every however so often. Sweet Christmas. And then Godsplaining is the one that I contribute to with 4 other Dominican friars. And we actually just did an episode on, like whether you ought to choose the best. That's episode 170. So, you can find that there. And I wrote a book. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. And some of this type of thing, this type of conversation actually appears in chapters 7 and 8. So those are the ones that I was most excited about writing and which I think are ultimately most helpful. So if you make it to the end of the book, hey, cheers to you. All right. Know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me. And I look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.